Okay, so we're going to have a look at 3D in Flash CS4. If we create ourselves a new Flash file, okay, so let's go for new Flash file using ActionScript 3. Right, now before we explore 3D in Flash CS4, it's worth mentioning two key limitations. The first one, and probably the most frustrating for 3D designers, is there's no 3D drawing interface inside Flash, so you can't create a 3D scene and position elements where you want them, and there are no 3D shapes like spheres and toruses and cubes and so on. There's also no import functionality for bringing things in from 3D Studio Max or Maya or similar. But don't despair, there's a lot of functionality there. The second limitation that's worth mentioning is that the layer order, the stacking order that we see in Flash still takes priority. So no matter how hard you try to change stacking order using Z positions and moving things backwards and forwards, you actually won't achieve it. The layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 always basically takes priority. That means that you really need to pay attention to where you position your content, pay attention to the stacking order of your layers, and also really keep things simple. That's the most important thing to say with 3D in Flash at this stage. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to try and produce a 3D scene where we have a floor element going into the distance and some content that flies towards us and then behind us effectively. Now to do this, we're going to first of all create a new library item, which is going to be our floor. And into that we're going to draw a rectangle. Now this rectangle I'm going to call texture the layer, because I'm going to try and apply a sort of bitmap texture to it. To achieve this, first of all, let's get it positioned. We'll put it at 0 and 0, and a rough guess, let's make it 1,000 pixels wide and 1,000 pixels tall. So not absolutely massive, but definitely big enough to fit on the stage in both forwards and backwards point positions. Right, next thing to do, we actually want to apply the bitmap fill to it. So window and colour, and rather than choosing linear or radial, we're going to go for this bitmap option, where we can choose a file. This metalslip.jpg is in your working in 3D folder, and it's actually just one of the patterns from Fireworks CS4. I've just copied the file in here. So we click open, and you can see you get a really nice texture applied to your object. This sort of like very steely type approach there. Great. So that's my first part. Next, we're going to apply another layer, which we're going to call gradient. Now what I want to try and do is set up a gradient such that the top edge of this texture is darker than the bottom edge. It should be relatively easy to do. We can just draw a rectangle in over the top of that, get it roughly the same size, select it, and then let's change its x and y to 0 and 0, and make sure the width and height are 1,000 each, just to match. Okay, next thing to do is to choose a simple linear gradient. There we go. And then to rotate that gradient, use the gradient transform tool and spin it round like so. Okay, dark at the top, light at the bottom. Now I could, just to get that to apply a dark and light, just by sticking some alpha in on the gradient. But a much neater way is to use the blend modes. But a simple shape can't actually have access to the blend modes. We need to first convert this to a symbol, which we'll call gradient. And then we can just apply a very simple blend mode of, say, overlay. And you can see in no time at all we've got a really neat texture applying there. Dark at the top, light at the front. Very, very quick and easy to do. That's our floor done, so let's come back to scene 1. Let's go into our floor, there it is, and let's pick that up and drop it on the stage. Now that's roughly central. If I'm not sure, I can always just quickly go into outline mode and I can see that there. So all's good. But at the moment my floor is at the wrong orientation. I actually want it almost flat, like a work surface, rather than at this sort of like 90-degree angle looking at the camera. To achieve this, we're going to use the 3D rotation tool, third tool or fourth tool down here in the list. Click on that. And then you get this really slightly strange looking icon comes up in the middle. The best way to work out what it does is to use a combination of trial and error. So when we hover on it, we get X, Y, and Z rotation depending on which component we move on. So let's just try Z. And you can see Z rotation sort of spins around an imaginary axis that goes into the paper. So I'm just going to move that around and then go, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Edit, undo. Let's try the Y rotation. What's that do? Oh, this way. Oh, that's interesting. Could be useful for some walls, perhaps, but again, not really what I'm after, so undo that. X rotation. Ah, now that's the one. And that's giving me a floor-like surface that disappears into the distance. Fantastic. So that's exactly what I wanted. And then all I need to do then is take my black mouse pointer and simply move that down, up and down the page until it's in the right position. A bit too far there. Moved it off of the view, so let's try and find that again. About 25%, oh, it's all out there. Okay, so move that down. And I want it somewhere about there. Now, the trick here is not to lose it. So that's the bottom of the stage, so you won't see it unless it's there. So put it into that position. Always preview, because your designer doesn't give you the true look and feel of how this is going to look. So that needs to go up a little bit, like that, on the preview. Not bad. Could do with probably being squashed a little bit. So let's actually try and resize this. So we'll try and hold down our key like this and resize that down like that. There, isn't it? So a nice little view there. Let's shrink it in a little bit like that. Let's give that a quick test. So simply just using the free transform tool to resize it. Really quite a nice effect there from our floor surface. So again, disappearing into the distance. Now the white sky looks somewhat unrealistic in the background there. So to solve that, if we rename this layer floor, we can lock that layer because we're done with that. And we can create a new layer called sky. All sky needs to be is a simple rectangle, nothing more, nothing less. So we can just draw a rectangle. I'm going to draw it in, and then I'm just going to set the properties to get it right position. So black mouse pointer, select the rectangle, 0 and 0, 550 by 400, little gradient. Okay, so we'll just choose a colour to start off with, bring up the colour window, and apply a simple linear gradient to that. And we'll go from white through to sort of light sky blue, I think. Like that. And perhaps lighten that at the bottom a little bit, just a touch. Take the gradient transform tool, spin it round. Really simple idea. Squash it down a little bit. Move it up a touch. Squash it down a little bit. You get a really nice simple effect. That layer though needs to be behind the floor. Remember, the 3D is still at the mercy of the stacking order of the layers. Quick test, and you can see then you've got some sky in the distance and a floor that runs up until that sky. So really nice simple effect in there. Okay, so we've managed to achieve our sort of layout, our scene. What we now need to move on to is think a bit about our movement. So let's save the file there. We'll save it as scene.fla in that folder. And we'll move on to the